Let's go. I'm gonna give you a hard time now.
His wife's my friend.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I bet. That's Matt couldn't hear me up here.
You can't argue.
This
was a prompting from God.
It's a prize.
You got that wrong.
That's crazy.
Right.
That's good.
You got a lot better chance hearing the Holy Spirit moving through him than me. Let's be honest. Okay. Let's.
Love it.
I think that's your brother. I don't. It's a guy.
Well, that's what,
It's funny.
that's what Tim said too. Apparently I've got a doppelganger in Pennsylvania.
What's that? All right.
He was asking me if I was related to his, this guy I know or something, so, sorry.
By the way, I just learned the definition of that about 2 months ago when I was told someone was my doppelganger. And I thought, that don't sound right, man. I don't know what a doppelganger is, but then I realized.
I haven't been in a gang in years.
Yeah, I know, man. Just sounded wrong. I don't know. Something doppel just didn't. So, yeah.
I have a question as you get going. So I got a chance to talk to just a couple guys quick.
Yeah.
And one of the things that came up as we ended our conversation was, hey, I got to get your information. Are you going to, or can you, kick each other's
Yes.
information in like a one email? So
Yes, we'll do it at the end of the event.
all right.
We'll make sure everyone's up to date. Yes, we'll give everyone, we'll do phone numbers, emails, so here's the thing. We're sharing each other's info with this group unless you ask us to do otherwise. You can come separately to us. But part of the goal is we will walk this cohort together for a period of time. So we're going to see each other online. We'll be here. Again, you're going to learn at least as much from each other as you're going to learn from us, right? I mean, that's really, especially as you see things begin to happen out there. And yeah, we want you all to be friends. That's part of the reason we're doing this journey together. So, and you'll get other questions, because I know there's people who are sitting here going, well, I'm a pastor, I got a question. Scott, how'd you do that transition? So it's going to be all kinds of things you're going to start asking questions. How do I do the inner city thing with you? So whatever it is, you're hearing it in the room of who to go have a processing question with. Hey, real quick, before we go into material, I want to talk just for a few minutes. And I want to talk about 3 shifts that need to occur for us to be successful in getting this done. We need 3 shifts. You can steal it, preach on it later if you want to. It's better with us as a crowd, not all of the points your people will care about. But 3 shifts that need to happen in the United States to see a movement occur. Let's go to the simple one first. The first shift that we have to make is we have to convince the church to move away from knowledge to obedience. From knowledge to obedience. So, now for most of you, I think we're probably on the same page, but let's make sure. In Matthew 28, when we get to the Great Commission, who here could quickly just quote the Great Commission out loud? You guys got it.
Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey all that I have commanded you.
And
I'll be with you.
I'll be with you what?
Always.
Always.
To the end.
By the way, I'll speak on that tomorrow, by the way. I think that's one of the most important passages of all Scripture. I think it's actually the character and identity of God. I'll come back to that. But teaching them to use the other word too, which is correct, to obey or observe, right? You whispered observe.
Yeah,
You said observe,
yeah.
she said obey. So here's the thing. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church where every Sunday, Miss Lizzie, Grandma Lizzie, who's like my grandmother, literally would push me into a corner and make me quote verses that I hadn't learned during the week. And when I had my ADD moment, she'd slap my leg, catch my attention, and made me learn it. And when I learned and quoted those verses, I'd get my little star on the board. I don't want you to know today, I'm a 53-year-old adult male, and there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over the flocks by night. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, the glory of the Lord shone round about. I promise you, at her funeral, when they were saying, hey, do you have something you remember Miss Lizzie by? I stood up and quoted that verse, and with 300 people in the room, about 225 began quoting that verse with me.
Funny how they can knock the ADD right out of you.
She knocked it out of me. She did. She beat it into me. But can I tell you this? I didn't catch one bit of my soul. Like I wasn't a horrible person, but I could quote everything she beat into me, but it didn't change me. I had grown in knowledge. I knew nothing of what it meant in practice. We have got to make sure we understand I think when we heard teaching them, what we have is a whole world of leaders to say, Jesus said, teach and we'll teach. And Jesus didn't say that. He said, teach them to obey everything I've done, everything I've commanded you. And this obedience space. Now, I'm sitting, listen, I'm on a conference call. I'm on a training event. Some of you might have been in there. It's Bobby Galladay and stuff. It's with all the Discipleship Now. They had me on a breakout event. I've got about 100 leaders in the room. And a guy asked me this. He said, I've got a problem with your concept of obedience-based discipleship. I think it sounds legalistic and non-biblical. And I said, well, it's interesting. So I quoted Matthew 28. So what do you do with Jesus saying, teach me to obey? By the way, let's just go with one other verse. So Jesus preaches the entire Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount, everything all the way through to the very end. Jesus' final story, 5, 6, 7, 8, multiple chapters in scriptures. Anyone know the final story that Jesus preaches on? Go ahead.
The firm foundation.
There you go. So let me ask this, because by the way, I'm going to make sure, let's see how close you are. When he preaches on the firm foundation, what is he actually saying? What's he telling you to do?
Take what he's done and apply it.
Now, by the way, make sure you hear this. What I hear people preach all the time is Jesus is the firm foundation, which is true. That's not what Jesus is teaching in that passage. What Jesus says in the passage, he said, he who hears everything I just taught you for the 4 chapters previously, or the hour or 2 sermon, he who hears what I said, and you put it into practice, is like a wise man who builds his house on a rock. He who just heard everything I said and does not put it into practice is a foolish man who builds his house upon the sand. So here's what he says. The wise and the foolish hear the exact same message. The distinction of the two is a foundation based on whether you practice it or not. You put it into practice, you're wise. If you ignore Jesus, you're foolish. Jesus says that. Is there anybody else who says it? I mean, Jesus. This now makes more sense when you hear the book of James, right? And you hear other things. But Jesus clearly just began with that reality. The wise man is the one who puts it into practice. So all I want to argue is one of the biggest issues of the church is we have bought a model for an education system in America, which is bring the kids into a room, sit them down, rinse, repeat, say it again and again, and they'll learn it. That's been it. So information is what we've been teaching as our educational system. You memorize stuff, but that doesn't lead to life change.
Right.
Shift 2, so once we go from information to practice, it's obedience and practice. Then the second shift is, that means as a pastor, I need to change from an information dispenser to a model mentor role. I need to move from the pastor concept of I'm here dispensing information to the model mentor. Now, 2 things need to happen with this. Guys, if you don't get anything else out of this weekend, could you at least do this? If you spend 20 hours a week working on a message, do me a favor this next week. Spend 10 hours working on your message and spend 10 hours just figuring out how to apply it. Yeah. The pastors that spend 20 hours on a message, you're figuring it out. I mean, listen, I'm not saying that's bad. Don't hear me. But if you don't spend 5 minutes going, how do I help them apply this to their life? Yeah. You've ruined the entire thing. I mean, it just means nothing. So we have to help our people put it into practice. I did a seminar for Kentucky Baptist Convention for an evangelism conference. 150 pastors and leaders, they piled into the room because this is what I said. They said, what will you do your topic on? I said, how to reach people far from God. And so the assumption of the person walking in the room was, you're going to tell me how to preach a message to reach those who are lost. And I actually said, no, I want to help you reach the people who are sitting in your pew every week that you think actually have a relationship with God, but they feel far from God. I said, your average person doesn't know how to pray. Your average person doesn't know how to share. Your average person doesn't know how to listen. They think they've checked the box and they got the star just like I did, because Miss Lisenby whacked them upside their ADD head, got them into the chair, and I sat there and listened. And even though they've done nothing with it, we go, that's a spiritual giant. I mean, it seems crazy to me that you can have a 70-year-old believer who's been in church for 50 years, they're nasty and bitter, have no relationship with their kids, can't forgive, they're angry at things in life, and yet we have them in charge of the Sunday school because they've been the ones who've been there the longest. Right? And you're thinking, wait a second, forgiveness. Let me ask you all this, in your estimation. Spiritually mature or brand new believer, at what point should you learn the power of forgiveness?
New.
Thank you for saying it, because I wasn't going to say it to one person. Listen, isn't that a day one learning? So how can I be 50 years later and not be able to forgive? It's because no one's ever told me I have to put it into practice. Oh, I knew I was supposed. I mean, they'll quote it.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean they know how to do it. They'll be bitter, they'll be anxious, they'll be frustrated, they don't know what peace is.
Yeah.
The fruit in their life is just, it's not off the floor, except the parts that are dying. And yet they've been there their whole life. We have to move them first from knowledge to that actual practice and application, that obedience-based part. And then we, in the shift, have to go, how do we communicate in such a way that it actually becomes model mentor? So here's the other thing with the pastor. We need to stop thinking of it as, I'm a teacher and you're the student, to I'm a carpenter and you're my apprentice. Right? So if I want you to build a piece of furniture, but you don't know what wood, a hammer, and a nail is, I could preach for days about hammers, nails, and wood. I could talk about textures and concepts. I could talk about swinging. I could talk about everything. Or what else could I do? I could put a hammer on a table, a nail, and a piece of wood, and say, pick it up and take a swing. Let me show you how to swing it so you don't hurt yourself, and then back up and let you swing. What would you rather do, men? You want to hear me proliferate for a few hours, or do you want to take a swing? Okay. So our problem is we need to stop thinking of discipleship from a knowledge perspective and think of it from the mentoring modeling, where we really go back to how it was in Jesus' day, where they caught it more than they taught it. They watched them do it. Everything Jesus did. Listen, we'll do this in book 2, but you know, when Jesus in Luke 2 and Luke 10 and stuff, when he sends out his disciples 2 by 2, he tells them what he's going to do, tells them how to do it, sends them out 2 by 2. They come back, he debriefs with them, how did it go, and then celebrated with them, and then said, oh, by the way, let me catch the vision. Don't celebrate that the demons, submitted to you. Celebrate your names in the book of life, right? Because so he recast the vision. Hey, that's no big deal. Here's the big deal. I've forgiven you. Don't forget that, right? So he just, that's what and by the way, you cannot mentor and model without getting close. I mean, you have to spend time with them. And so we need to figure out how this shift comes in our roles as pastors, leaders, and ministries and stuff. How do I actually help make sure that we swing a hammer with people until they can swing it themselves? And I have to think of it as an apprentice. I think apprentice would be a lot better word than disciple.
Yeah.
Because people understand the distinction.
Yeah. It's churchy. They've always heard it. And it's just,
But listen, an electrician apprentice makes sense.
Yeah.
For the next 5 years, I'm going to bring you under me. We're going to start with a lot of book knowledge and labor stuff, and slowly I'm going to mentor you through until you're a master electrician and I can release you, right? They understand the process. This is where I'm going. This is what I'm trying to get accomplished, and at the end of this, I can do it. But here's the truth, though. Every master electrician should be able to do what for the next generation, though?
Have another apprentice.
That's exactly right. I mean, you see, that's normal and natural in those worlds.
Yeah.
And by the way, how many of you want a doctor who is a brain surgeon getting ready to do surgery on you, and yet you find out he spent 20 years in school and became a professor, but had never actually done one surgery before?
Yeah.
I mean, like, it's not rocket science. Do you really want a pilot who's only learned by books? flying down here. I mean, you want someone who got on the plane with somebody next to them and said, here's how you do it. Watch me.
Yeah.
Oh, do it. I'm standing here with you. I don't want you to burn that vessel off of the brain because that brain won't work anymore. Right? I mean, you need someone to walk you through this. It's the same thing spiritually. And by the way, that's what they did. You go back to their model of learning, that's what they had always done. It was expected, we'll talk about the definition of discipleship later, it was always expected a disciple not only listened to, but did everything his master told him. They did it. That's normal by definition. Apprentice would be a better word. Third, the shift from that practical, just knowledge to obedience, from just the teacher, laity, pastor thing down to the, hey guys, we've got to be able to get this down to model mentoring. By the way, we also have to break down the pastor-laity divide, but that's another dialogue. Let's get the third one though. I want to challenge you on this. I want to talk about the role of a pastor and leaders. Let's go with a dialogue real quick. I'm so disappointed I don't have a whiteboard, but by the way, I do have a whiteboard. This is the whiteboard they had here.
I think that's great.
I'm not even bothering, just so you all know. Yeah, I'm just like, you've got to be kidding. So, hey, we apologize. This is the first time in this place. We've been right down the street, and they sold out, and we wanted to check another venue. We've done multiple venues. The first events, we brought everything in, and they had it all in the place. So we didn't have to bring anything. We shifted over here, didn't even realize I didn't bring anything. Right, and they have not, this is, and by the way, she doesn't have a marker. I'm like, okay, so I'll probably just go by Post-it notes later. So forgive me, I apologize. That's my fault. So let's go to shepherd. Let's look at David in the Old Testament as a shepherd. Okay, let me tell you, what was David's daily job as a shepherd like? Tell me, what did David do?
Got dirty.
He got dirty. How did he get dirty? What were the things he did to get dirty?
Fed.
So the shepherd fed the flock. That's good. What else did he do?
Protection.
Protected them. Lions, tigers, bears. He fought them all off, right? What else did he do?
He was in the elements.
He was in the elements. By the way, he had to be with them again, which we were just saying a minute ago. Shepherd, he was actually with them, protecting them, feeding them, and by the way, setting up the perimeters around them at night, protecting them. What else?
Threw him over his shoulders. They just got dirty sheep all over
He
his.
carried them, like if they needed it, trained them. They knew him by voice. What else did he do?
I think go ahead.
No, I mean, he had to practice the sling at some point.
Yeah, that whole.
I mean, I know that's not necessarily with the sheep, but I mean, I think part of that was, you have some downtime.
It was a skill set that he did. It was a skill set he developed while being out in the wilderness,
Correct.
hanging out, right?
Yeah.
He's sitting there bored in the afternoon with the tree close by, and he's swinging rocks at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or his favorite sheep, he's just pelting for the fun of it, which I'm sure our ADD class would be doing also. So yeah, let's go. What else? He protected them.
I think he had to know was a big thing. He had to know what their instincts were, what they were prone to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Who's going to wander away? Who's going to stay closer by?
Right.
By the way, he had to find the water, green pastures, still waters. He found them for him. But which one's just going to follow me naturally versus which one do I need to take the rod and kind of help him along?
Right.
Which one's going to be the one that nips and bites at the other ones and starts stuff?
I mean, he probably had names for them, honestly.
I have, in fact, we know he had names.
Yep.
Because I don't care what farm I go to, they always have names for their animals. Even if they're killing them, they had names for them. Like, oh, that's Betsy. Like, they all look the same. That's Betsy, that's Judy, that's Donna. They know. So you're right, he probably had names.
Yeah.
It was a relationship.
Farmers, they all talk about it, they make that up on the spot when guys like you come up.
Oh, is that what they do? Just act like I know. That's what too much opportunity. And he's like, that's stupid city boy. He doesn't know. That's right.
He thinks we name them all.
I was told if they're planning on killing them, they don't name it because then they don't feel bad.
They don't feel bad at all. That's exactly. Yeah, that's the other city boy thing they do. So let me make sure. So here's the good thing. A shepherd protects, provides, leads, guides. We see them doing it. Lions, tigers, and bears, the still waters, everything. That's what a shepherd does. But I'm just going to say something. I want you all to hear me. And then we're going to talk about this too. So that's what a shepherd does on a daily go-to. But make sure you hear the difference I'm about to say to you. You just described the role of the shepherd. But let me ask you the question. What's the goal of being a shepherd? Think about it out. Not the role, what's the goal?
I would say to increase the revenue, which means he needs more sheep.
Make sure you hear this.
Multiply.
Multiplying the sheep is one of the primary goals of a shepherd. There's two goals primary. What's the second primary goal? The end of the season. At the end of the season, you've been out in the field for 4 months. You come back in. The end of the season. What are you hoping to do?
Shear them.
Shear them.
Get fruit, the fruit of your labor.
There's a fruit of the labor of shepherding. So make sure, and by the way, you can eat them too. But it really messes up the rest of the illustration. So let's stick with the first two predominantly, okay? Stick with me, all right? It helps.
Starving.
All right, that's all. So listen. The role of a shepherd is to protect, provide, lead, and guide. The goal of the shepherd is to help creations see the fruit of what they've been created to do and to multiply them. Let me tell you one of our issues. We have pastors who are magnificent at their roles, but they've never once accomplished the actual goal. We can do the role and actually miss the entire goal of shepherding. Guys, this is a travesty. This means Satan can be excited when we protect, provide, lead, and guide as long as we're not multiplying and helping them produce the fruit of the labor. He can lull us into this understanding that we've been successful because we have large flocks and exciting things happening, and I've taken care of them, and it's all there. But the truth is, I want you all to be thinking like Genesis chapter 30 with Jacob, or is it 28 with Jacob? Jacob has this dream, and in his dream, he starts this strategic thinking of spotted sheep versus pure sheep, right? And by the way, he had a dream for how it should be done, and he came back and strategically began breeding the sheep. And he was so successful at his daily role that the goal was so much, they were so exceedingly wealthy that you couldn't even keep them together. See, the successful shepherd is not the one who protects, provides, and leads and guides. The successful shepherd is the one who understands that when they protect and provide and lead and guide, it ends up in multiplication. And if you don't have the strategy of multiplication, what are you protecting, providing, leading, and guiding for? Let me give you a negative on it to make sure, because it'll make it come together, that we're all playing the same game here. So I was with a pastor who said, my job, my primary role is to feed the sheep, and my sheep are fat. Okay, let's just stick with that part of the illustration. So you all know, by the way, I didn't say this to him initially. I just kept quiet and walked away for a moment. You got to realize, unless they want to hear you, there's no sense in talking unless you can have a prophetic moment. Or I look to Matt, and Matt's going to say it regardless because he's the prophet. He'd be like, forget it, you idiot, what are you saying? So, the grace part of me, I pause long enough, Matt won't. Okay, so, but then again, that's why you're here, Junior, and you know, so, and Chris, because he just says it, right?
Yeah.
So, it's the bully thing. But, so, anybody who knows enough about sheep, do y'all know what the problem is with an unsheared or fat sheep? Y'all ever heard about a sheep when the sheep falls over? Oh, good. So here's what's interesting. Sheep's legs are very short. And if a sheep falls over, its little legs will just kick forever, which is why you don't realize with your illustration, the shepherd actually has to come along and grab the sheep and pick it back up because sheep can rarely stand up by themselves. They can. Here's when they can. When they're thin and when they're newly sheared, a sheep can maneuver and get back up. But if it's unsheared, it's so fluffy, and if it's overweight, it's so heavy, it can't get back up unless the shepherd grabs them and lifts them up. Now, two things I need to hear you to hear with this. Number one, when the sheep falls over, it actually means, because they can't get up, they're the most vulnerable to the enemy. Because a wolf that walked into the crowd, if he sees 100 sheep standing up and one on its side going like this, which one do you think he's going towards? Number two, there's this process called casting. You just Google it later, you'll see. It happens with horses, it happens with sheep, some other animals. Casting means when they fall down on the ground, if not lifted back up, the weight of the animal will slowly crush the organs and it will actually asphyxiate. It'll actually die. It'll just die right there. It doesn't take long when they're overweight and unsheared. Here's how you want to remember it. The word casting, when that animal's dying, is the same word translated in Psalm 51 when David says to God, "Cast me not away from your presence, O Lord. Restore unto me the joy of salvation." What I think David is saying, as I watch the sheep laying on the ground, suffocating and dying, that's what I feel like you've done with me because of my sin. I feel like I'm casted away from you. And the restoring means, would you come pick me back up and restore the life to me, the joy of my salvation, versus allowing me to die in my sin right there. Y'all with me on that picture? Okay. Here's what I want to argue from our role. A fat sheep, well-fed followers of Jesus are actually the most vulnerable to the enemy if all they're doing is getting fat. Number two, an unsheared sheep is vulnerable to the enemy because it's never actually been equipped to do the works of ministry. So an unsheared and fat sheep is actually a horrible thing. A lean, sheared sheep is what you want. Here's what we're challenging in this shift. We need to shift our thinking, what I need us to do. If you're not already there, you may be thinking, I'm just giving you words from what might be going on in your soul. I need to do the role that I'm doing to protect, provide, lead, and guide, but I must never forget the goal is multiplication and equipping for the fruit. And I can be successful in my role every day and completely miss the goal of the entire ministry that he's called us to do. So I can have a pastor look at you, and these guys have been with me. I've heard pastors say it. Some would say it to me now. Kevin, I am so freaking busy. You just don't understand. I don't have time to make disciples. They say it all the time. And I want, when I hear those words, I just want them to keep asking questions so they'll say it again, and maybe they'll hear their own words. I'm too busy to make disciples and go, wait a second, there's only one thing Jesus asked. Yeah. Make disciples. And so don't forget this. He didn't ask us to do a weekend worship. Weekend worship is a normal thing that happens out of the process of discipleship. So does worship just help me become a disciple, or is part of discipleship to actually do worship? By the way, I think it's both and. Don't miss me on it. Right? But you need to ask yourself some of these questions. Wait a second. Because here's the thing. I can do a weekend worship and never make a disciple.
Yeah. That's what's happening.
We have to ask the question at least, right?
And the difficult thing too is that, when Scripture says specifically to the shepherd, know the state of your flock, it's actually, it's bad.
Yeah.
It's really bad.
Tony Wallace, that's his name, Tony. Silverdale Church, Tennessee, good sized church, a couple thousand people. They're doing an amazing work. They're doing some great stuff. Has nothing to do with the size of this church though, but Tony was a pig farmer. And so even as we talked about this, Tony just said, you need to know, growing up on a pig farm, the number one thing I look for every year is what was the best sow, a female pig, and what was the best boar, or whatever they call them. And he said, our whole goal the entire season was to figure out how do we multiply the best and get the best out of them. And I would say, well, it's because you want the fattest. Don't you want like the biggest fat? I remember the day he went, no. I said, we don't want the fattest. He said, you want the meatiest that's the leanest. I remember him even saying, he goes, no. You want a big animal, but you don't want him fat. You want him lean but large. I thought that was interesting, just even how he thought. And so how do we take that same mentality and come back to our church? Wait a second. My goal is multiplication. If I can protect, provide, and lead and guide, but we haven't multiplied anything, I'm missing something. By the way, just play the illustration out in reverse. You go through the season, you protect, provide, lead, guide, there's no multiplication, and there's no cheering. By next year, what's going to happen?
You have less sheep.
Next year, what's going to happen?
Less sheep.
How long do we have to go on, right? You can protect, provide, lead, and guide right to the death of the flock. It tends to be what's happening in our churches in America right now.
Plateau or decline.
Yeah, 85% are in the plateau decline. 10% of them above that are in a growth mode, quote unquote, but most of that growth is occurring from other churches. Less than 5% are actually growing by new believers.
They call it shifting sheep, right?
Yeah, shifting sheep, same thing, right? So my best gift as a shepherd is to steal your sheep. By the way, and they don't intentionally do that, and there's some benefits to it. I mean, I'm not arguing it, but our real goal is we're trying to impact the lostness in America. That's what we want to do. So I just want to encourage you. The only way to do it is to get sheep to multiply. The role and the goal is the battle that we have to do in this room, right? And in my goal, I have to think, what does that look like with me as a model mentor? And what does that look like for me as I challenge people to move from knowledge to obedience? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Questions or comments?
What's the third shift?
Oh, sorry. The third shift is, the first shift would be moving from knowledge to obedience. The second shift would be moving from just normal pastoring to actually modeling mentoring, and the third one would be moving from the role of the pastor to the focus of the goal of the pastor. Sorry, I use the words, the shift would be moving from just the role to the goal. That my focus isn't on the role that I play, my focus is on the goal I'm trying to accomplish. And you do the role to get to the goal, but I can do the role without achieving the goal. Thank you. Sorry about that. Didn't clarify well. Other questions or comments? Okay. So what we want to do,
So say the three kind of in a row.
Sorry, I'm
I
saying
have them
it.
written down, so just
Just make it one. Okay, you just make sure. The number one is, how do I do the shift from the knowledge towards obedience? I need obedience based, not knowledge. Number two, how do I make the shift in the role of pastoring from the normal pastor teacher to model mentor? And by the way, it should also be from laity to clergy to laity, but that's a whole other topic that we're not going to go to in this time. And the third one is, how do I make the shift from the role being my focus to the goal of pastoring being my focus? What's the role versus the goal of pastoring? And on that second one, the real key is it's really empowered and released laity. When I look out and say our goal is to empower and release people. That's what's going to make that shift to model mentors when I empower and release. So let me ask you this question. When we talk about disciples, if you want to look at Matthew 28, by the way, I would pull up, let's all just look at Matthew 28 at the end of it real quick. Because there's one more thing we have to agree on Otherwise, if our agreement is to disagree here, it makes it really easy. You probably don't want to tolerate me for too long. So you'll be like, okay, I'm done with this class. But let's agree on one thing. So if we want to get it, but make sure we're looking at the words together. If you want to flip up your Bibles, Matthew 28. Why doesn't somebody just go ahead and read the Great Commission one more time?
All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age.
Okay. So let's go to verse 19 real quick. We won't spend time. I'm assuming you know the basics of all of this, by the way. All of these are participles right here. What's the primary verbiage? There's really only one actual command out of this, and what's the command?
Go.
Make disciples. Everything else is part of the processes of making disciples. It's one thing. But listen, when he says, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey, and surely I'm with you. So who is Jesus speaking to when he makes this statement?
Immediately the 11.
Okay? And, right, because there's 11 with him right there.
Right.
Right?
Immediately.
Immediately the 11. So when you say immediately, then who else is he speaking to? If you're talking immediately, is there beyond immediately?
He's saying pass on this message.
Pass on this message.
So he's
who's
talking
he-
to everybody beyond them.
It's
Okay.
written for us.
So he's passing it beyond them. It's written for us. So in this sense, as I'm saying this to you right now, do I have the authority? I'm using this lightly. You should go make disciples then. According to this biblical passage, who is responsible to carry this out? All of his disciples.
Yeah.
So if I'm a disciple, then what am I called to do?
Disciple.
And if they're a disciple, then what would they be called to do?
Make disciple.
Okay. So this is where we're going to come back and just go, if I'm reading this passage correctly and the implications are correct, like you may want to argue against the implications, okay? But if what our understanding is, Jesus said make disciples, and the understanding that they're disciples and they embrace it, then their responsibility would be to make disciples also.
Yeah.
So let's do, I got the quote, someone said Ray Stedman say this, I've never seen it proven by Ray, but we can all agree with it. And we can say the negative too. So we're saying every disciple should be making disciples that would ultimately make disciples. Would that be a fair summary of what we're reading here?
Yes.
Let's say the negative. The negative is also easier to say. If you're making disciples who aren't making disciples, then you're not actually making a disciple. So would we also agree with that? If I'm making a disciple who isn't making a disciple, then I haven't yet made a disciple. Or if I've made a carpenter apprentice who supposedly become a master carpenter, and they can't make a carpenter apprentice who could become a carpenter, then I probably haven't really made a true carpenter yet. Because you can't pass it on, right? I mean, like, that's what we're talking about, like apprenticeship-wise. So our goal is to make disciples that make disciples that can make disciples. If you're good with that, it's easy for us to move on. If you're stuck on that, we need to clarify some things. Otherwise, I just want you to know, here's the number one problem with discipleship in America today when we're talking about it, is we're all using the same word, but we're using different definitions.
Yeah.
So we can walk out of here jazzed about discipleship, and you just start talking to some disciple, and they're going to go, yeah. And then you watch what they do, you're like going, I don't agree with what you're doing. It's because they're not using the same definition you're using. They're using the same words you're using, but they're not using the same definition you're using. So this is one of the big shifts, is even in our language when it's, by the way, you used the word disciple maker. Did y'all catch that earlier? He said disciple maker. He added to it because I just want you to know, if you don't clarify what you're trying to do, then most people are going to assume that they've already done what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
So if you even stand up in your church saying, hey, My goal is that you become a disciple of Jesus. They're all gonna be like, I am, yeah, that's me, okay? Wait a second. Let me clarify what a disciple of Jesus is. A disciple. Now, by the way, we have to make up words because the current word is all messed up, right? That's why I like apprenticeship would be better.
Yeah.
When I say disciple, I mean that you've actually grown into a place in your spiritual journey where you're pouring into someone else who's growing in their spiritual journey, and they're actually pouring into someone else in their journey, and all of you are beginning to live, love, and look like Jesus more. However it's going to be, right? Whatever you want to call it, I don't care. And then if you say, so are you doing that? You're probably going to get silence or crickets or, oh, is that what you mean when you say disciple? I thought you meant, do I show up at church and give and serve on occasion? Because I do that. And again, that's a good start. Don't get me wrong. You're all with me on that. So we need to be clear on our definition. Our goal is to make a disciple who will grow in their faith enough that they can make a disciple, who can grow in their faith that they'll make a disciple. And make sure you hear this really clearly from me. You can do this in 6 months. It does not take 6 or 60 years. In fact, I want to tell you, as you start your training centers, one of the biggest mistakes the majority of us will make is we will go to our most seasoned people thinking they will adjust quickly to this, and I want you to know most of them will struggle vehemently with this. Because what do you do when you've done it the same way for 40 years and you're asking them to build something new?
Set my ways.
It's tough. By the way, their heart might be there, but it's tough. So my brother built his own house with his own hands. He just decided to do it. He was really smart. I'm not, but he's smart. And but when they laid the foundation, there was just a small ripple in the corner of the foundation. And I remember my brother like, dude, this is gonna be pandemic. He had to rent a diamond-tipped scraper and literally grind off. Listen, I could see it when I laid down. I knew what the problem was. But my brother knew something I didn't know. For those of you who ever built, anybody here ever built something with your hands? Okay. What happens if the foundation is just slightly off? Like the corner of the room's off. The whole house is off. Right? At that little point, you don't realize, but something that just is 1 degree off, it's like shooting for the moon. You shoot for the moon, you miss it by 1 degree, you miss it by 100,000 miles, right? It's not like it's something small. You just add time and it really gets off. So he literally spent hours grinding it off, saying it's the only way to make the building square and correct. And so here's what I realized. I think the average person in our church, it's like being in the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Y'all know that the Leaning Tower of Pisa is a perfectly functional, excellent building. The building is good. You know what the problem is? The foundation. So, but here's what's happened. When you're on the inside of the building, the wall looks crooked, and you're standing on a crooked floor. And here's what I think most people are doing spiritually. They're trying to rebuild the room inside the Tower of Pisa to make it look flat and correct, when that's not the actual problem. The actual problem is the foundation outside. And so what happens in our churches is we have people who are inside the building trying to make the walls look good, but the problem is the foundation, and they haven't identified the actual issue. What I'm pulling you back to think about today is when we go into this, we're redefining the foundation. Here's what I want to do. The reason we wrote the book the way we did, the reason we're going to talk about the process is, I want to argue that the number one problem with discipleship is we don't have a simple, clearly defined, solid foundation.
Amen.
Just that simple. Our goal is to give, hear this, a small foundation that's easily reproducible and can be built upon. Don't spend, you don't need a foundation the size of this room. Just start with a quarter. Get the foundation correct, and then then you can build. So, and we're going to clearly define the foundation like this. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's wrong. I'm just saying it, okay. One of my friends just gave, and we're going to talk about this on the next session, he gave me a book for 18 months of discipleship, and for 18 months you spent time in a small group weekly trying to grow in your faith, grow in your walk with Jesus, and the second or third to the last week of 18 months was how to share your story. And I looked at him and I said, that sure doesn't make sense to me. He said, why? I said, shouldn't that like be week 3, not the 3rd to the last week? I mean, isn't the way to put your faith into practice is to do it? That's what Jesus said, right? And I remember he just looked at me and he goes, but they won't know the answers to the questions. Well, if you're mentoring them, either you'll be there helping them, or they'll go, you know, Junior, I don't know that answer. That's a great question. Hey, can we connect next week? And I'm going to go talk to my leader and see if I can find an answer or find out where we can look up that thing. Can we connect next week? Sure. All right. So, like, you have to change that paradigm on how we're thinking. Make it a smaller foundation. And in their mindset, I had to have this huge foundation. Listen, let me tell you what happened with Paul. Paul was gone in 18 months. And so what we're going to look at in a little bit is how in a very short period of time do I make a small enough foundation that will hold you for the rest of your life, that you can build off of forever and is easily reproducible in the person next to you, and then allow it to go from there. That's what we're going to try to accomplish during this time. Questions? Thoughts?
I think this, I think it's really important. Like, to me, this just screams young. Like, you can't start early enough. I mean, I understand that, like, you're gonna have an uphill battle with those that are like who have been. I know it's a weird, the old verbiage. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, we're not dealing with dogs. We're dealing with people, so it's possible. But you know, like from a student standpoint, I mean, to me, you know, it's like, invest early, invest often, and like this is vital, especially with the things that we were talking about with suicide and like everything, you know, just that we were talking about before we started. I don't know, is there like an age limit? I know that maybe David, I don't know if he's addressed this before with me, but like, what do you see? I mean, how early?
Oh, well, so listen, this is real simple. The younger they are, neuroscience would argue what a child learns in 5 days takes. He's 21 years of age and he's doing stuff. He's not that smart because he's more after me than, you know, the other generations around me. He looked at me one day, said, you know, he'd been wanting to be a teacher, and he came to me one day and he said, Dad, I made a decision. I'm going to be a junior high teacher. And we talked through all this stuff. I said, okay. About 6 months later, he came back and said, Dad, I changed my mind. I'm going to be a kindergarten teacher. And I said, why? And at 21, he said, I've already decided it'll be easier to form them at kindergarten than to fix them at 7th grade.
Yeah.
At 21, he understood that. And he's like, we got to get him younger, moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
And so there is no age that's too young. But here's what I want to argue. Remember, we're talking spiritual. So if someone comes to Christ at 50 years of age, they're a spiritual toddler.
Yeah.
They're baby.
No, I think
They will embrace it as quick. So you can have a spiritually immature old believer at 50, and you can have a baby that absorbs it at 50.
Yeah, I guess what like where I was tracking with that is how can you help the adults catch on? And I think, you know, I heard somebody say the wave always starts in the student section. It's never going to start in a stadium with the old folks. But they will do the wave once it gets going. You see what I'm saying? So to me, I'm thinking like, if you could really, you know, again, obviously go hard for adults as you know, like in my role, in my position, but like somebody like Anthony.
You should contact your youth director.
Yeah, I should have brought him. I should have brought him, but you know, it's like if you can really get students that are seeing fruit, it's kind of like I feel like it would be like the wave. I think you might get more adult participation because there's more traction faster. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. But
well, so there's a couple things.
Okay.
Number one, Scott, you're a grandparent, aren't you? Didn't you say you had 2 grandkids? By the way, one grandkid so far. You like your grandkid or your kids better? Honest question. Okay, so okay.
There's no.
Okay, so what's interesting?
Don't listen.
Here's what I want to tell you.
Turn the camera off.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're all over that. He said his kids. Okay. I'm in a church down in Florida that was pretty much a crowd of old people, and the entire crowd was complaining about their kids, and they were begging for Christ for their grandkids. Make sure you don't miss this. The secret for the adults is help them see the young generation as the next generation, and they will buy it.
Can I tell you that that is the reason for the transition with us? Was because of the younger generation and the impact that the younger people can have on the spiritual momentum of the older people, because what the older people really want to see are those students just worshiping Jesus. And that will engage them. But when it is a church of just older people, and maybe they're pretty critical of all that, and you don't have that setting, it's difficult. So it's like really embrace that next generation and do things. Move out of the way if you have to make the next generation flow, because the older generation will naturally gravitate to that.
But I think it's inevitable. Isn't it inevitable, though, that there's going to be some pushback? There are going to be some people are not going to go along, and they're going to be like, you're wrecking what we've always enjoyed. You're changing the purpose. And there's going to be pushback with some people.
And by the way, it has to be, because they're not even followers of Jesus yet, probably. So, but we won't talk about that now, right? Okay. No. So here's what's good about what you just said. Yeah, no, I was playing. So, no. So guys, make sure you know this. If I lead someone to Jesus, they will do anything I ask them in the next 5 or 6 months. If I've got a 30-year believer, it'll take them 5 to 6 years to do the same thing, maybe 7. So when a value is already established, it is a multi-year process to change a pre-built value. When the value is not established, all you have to do is establish it. Which is why with new believers, whatever you establish, that's what they believe that's normal. So this is why when Watchman Nee wrote The Normal Christian Life, okay? I don't know if y'all ever read that or something, but like, if you said, feeling the empowerment of the Holy Spirit and leading to someone to Jesus, that's not extraordinary, that's normal. Well, the average believer in our church would say that's extraordinary, right? They would say that's a job over here for the pastor, that's not normal for the believer, right? So what we have to do is this new generation, we have to give them what's normal. It's what most people would see as extraordinary. And just say, this is norm. This is what everyone should be experiencing. Listen, again, we're not going off about Nadim over there, but to see a wave of the Holy Spirit where people are being healed, dozens, I mean, not 1, 2 dozen, families are coming to Christ. I mean, it looks like it's coming straight out of the New Testament. And I come out of a historical background that says all of that stuff is ceased, right? So I'm not arguing over that right now. You know, I just stop and I just go, okay, I'm telling you, I've met these people all over the world, and God does amazing things. You know, the idea that God's not active, and I'm not arguing against it. I'm just going, it's new wine in old wineskins, right? Like it's tough, right? But if you give it time, and what a lot of the older ones too, they won't fully buy in, but if they believe that their grandchildren, what you need them is not to fight. What you need to them is at least have the heart that says, I believe. And as the stories happen, the stuff goes on, you'll create a whole new culture. But it'll take 5 to 7 years to create a whole new culture. And but again, if you start from scratch, that's why planting churches is so easy. You start from scratch. It's harder in that you have to get them to come to Christ. Oh, by the way, for all those who start, how many you planted a church? The believers that joined your church, was it easier to grow them or the new believers? Somebody who came to Christ when you planted your church.
New believers.
See, new believers. Tim, what you know, like new believers?
They're eager.
Huh?
Who's the eager?
One of the biggest mistakes people make when they start a church, they get a core group of Christians together and they talk about what they want to do. And after talking and praying for months, then they say, okay, let's go do it. And when the pastor goes to go do it, he looks around and only 2 people show up. He's like, where are the other 12? Oh, they're all busy. And then he goes back and says, hey, we're going to do another project. And 2 more show up. He's like, where's the other 12? Well, they're all busy. And then he asks a question. Hey, guys, why didn't you show up? Well, I love our small group, but, you know, I didn't really want to do that, what you're doing over here. And this is what he'll say. But I've always talked about that. And here's what they'll say. I love the concept of what you're saying, but I didn't understand the implications of what you're saying. I didn't know you actually meant you want me to go do it. So let me tell you the biggest secret you're going to find here. Whatever you want them to do on day 100, ask them to do day 1. Ask them to do it now. You'll find out really quickly who's going to be a part or not. You ask to, listen, Jesus said share your faith. The demoniac that came to Jesus, how long before Jesus asked him to share his story?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. He said, Jesus, I mean, guys, we have to struggle with this later. Jesus, I want to follow you. Actually, I want you to go back to your family and tell them what I did for you instead. Think about it. I mean, that's totally contradictory to normally what I would think. So what we want to do is we want to give people not just the knowledge we want them to have, but the habits. We want them to develop the skills and practices and habits from the beginning.
Yeah.
The toddler, you grab by his fingers, you just hold him up and you let him stumble across the floor. We're not actually asking for PhDs. I'm asking for toddling toddlers. And guess what? Let him toddle for a while, he'll walk. Right? So it's just natural. That's natural. So we just want to help recreate what should have been natural in the first place.
The whole time you're talking, I'm reminded of an illustration about like the foundation and learning it the wrong way first.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in boot camp in the Marines, we got to the rifle range in like week 11, and the first thing they asked was they got everybody together in our company, and they said, all right, we need to separate, those who know what they're doing, those who don't. And so they asked everybody here who your daddy taught you how to shoot, put your hand in the air. And all these guys be like, yeah! They're like, all right, since you guys know what you're doing, what we're going to do, we're going to move you guys over here. You're going to work with this instructor. He's one of the top-notch instructors. You guys go over there. We're going to take these guys. No joke. They all went into a classroom, and they handed us all our rifles, said, get on the line, start shooting. And they taught us how to shoot while shooting. Everybody else went in there. And my dad didn't teach me how to shoot. So I was on the line shooting day one. Those guys were in the classroom for 2 days, spending time going over all of the definitions to relearn how to use a rifle. And then they brought them out and made them dry fire them for a day before they gave them ammo. And when they realized that, they were ticked. And it was incredible. And I still remember, I mean, at the time I didn't think much of it except laughing at them, but years later, looking back and going, oh my goodness, that's what it's like to relearn, and anyway, so I think of that and I think, okay, so the implication of that in this scenario, I guess, is a question: is there wisdom in separating them when you're going to start that? The phrase I wrote down, you didn't say exactly like this, just kind of the way I heard it, was it's hardest for those who believe that they have a solid foundation, but it has been constructed with poor skills or incomplete definitions. So how do you rebuild that? Like, I feel like the first steps, are two different starting points.
Yeah.
So do you, is there any advice on that? Like, how do we do that?
So we're going to unpack that more as time goes on.
Okay, that's fair.
But let's just hit a little bit of it. I just want to encourage you. What you don't want to have happen is those who think they know what to do and actually messing up your new group. That's actually one of the things you need to watch.
Yep.
One of the biggest issues you'll find is when people think they know. You're going to hear this quickly, and we're going to talk about this a whole bunch during it. But you'll be like starting the Discovery Bible Study. We'll explain that. And you're going to say, hey guys, we're looking at this passage in Nehemiah. And then someone goes, oh, over the book of Jeremiah it says this, and then in the book of Acts it says this. And you're going to go, no, hey, do me a favor. Let's look back at the book of Nehemiah. But in the book of, no. What I'm asking you to do is to look at Nehemiah, right? What you'll have is those who want to give you all of their information and all their proliferations and all that's happened and occur when you're not asking for that. And what you'll find is people who don't know all that will lean right over into Scripture, and they're going to talk about what Scripture says.
Yeah.
And so you'll begin to see that. So what you'll have to do, you actually have to spend more time creating parameters for those who think they know what they're doing. And you don't have to do that with the new people. The new people, you just tell them this is what they'll do, and they'll go, okay. What you'll hear from the other one is the argument. You'll also begin to see this very soon when you say, go share your story, And what you're gonna find is it's often easier for a new believer to share their story than someone who's a follower for a long time. In fact, Matt will talk on this shortly, we're gonna teach on it, but I'll tell you what Matt's gonna say now. He's gonna argue one of my greatest frustrations is finding someone who's been a follower of Jesus for 20 years and they don't even have a story.
Worth sharing.
Because they can't even talk about what God's transformed in their life. And you'll see a brand new believer who said, by the way, I had a 16-year-old named Tommy, and Tommy called the youth leader, and by the way, he grew up in a really bad home, but called our youth leader, and he's asking her questions, and he said, well, what's the difference when you come to Jesus? She goes, well, I can tell you a little bit of what happened in my life. She goes, I felt this overwhelming sense of peace, and I felt God's presence, and I did this and that. And Tommy went like this. Oh my God, that's exactly what I feel. He goes, I was so stressed. He goes, I'm at home, I don't feel it. I feel like I'm talking to God. I feel like his presence is right here with me. Is that what it means? He's a brand new believer for a week. He's already going, I sense all of these things. That's what it means. That's part of it, right? But I don't want to ask the average 30-year believer if they're sensing God's presence and peace at this moment in time. I would hope, but we'll get there later. So you're going to find out with it. Listen, what I find is certain gift myths, like the people that are very apostolic and evangelistic will more quickly gravitate towards this because they've been waiting for the answer. They're going, the church hasn't answered it yet, and this is going to be the answer to what they've been waiting for years. Those are some of your most successful people. They'll be like, I've been waiting for this, Pastor, thanks. And they will do well. You just have to help hone them and guide them, direct them, give them the parameter to play in. One last thing, and sorry, Chris, you'll also see Dan Brindley started using this illustration, but he said one day I'm driving down the interstate and I'm doing 65 in a 70, but the car's in the left-hand lane blocking. He goes, he's like, listen, just do the speed limit, or at least get out of my way and let me drive. Like, at least let me do the speed limit. He goes, I'm sitting behind this car, and I'm like, they won't move. He said, so finally I got an opportunity. I just shifted lanes and I drove by. And he goes, what I realized as a church leader, he said, I often feel like I'm in a lane that they're not at the speed limit, but they're driving safely, but it's time to just get out and get in the other lane and create a new path. And so he always says, I just create a dual rail. I ask, how do I love and encourage those that I have? And how do I create a new path so that those that we're developing, it's, I don't want to say better, but a new path for this one, and allow it to happen, whatever happens over here at that point in time. So sometimes you have to create a dual path to be able to do it.
Yeah.
But we'll talk a little bit how to do that. We're really going to talk more about the new one, but some of you will be stuck trying to move out of the old one. I would suggest, by the way, start small and reproduce. The number one problem we have is people trying to start big. Just start small, start with what you want, and reproduce it. Nothing beats reproduction. I'm telling you later, your first things, I want to start another training center. We will get to this 6 to 9 months from now. You're going to start getting great fruit from this training. And then the first thing, we need to start another training center. So many people want to be a part. You don't want to start another training center. You need to reproduce your first training center. And we're going to talk about the difference of that. One is I want to add another 10 people under me. The other one is I'm going to find my 2 or 3 best and reproduce them to actually create another training center. Like, that's what we need to do here. And by the way, those 2 shifts will lead to multiplication versus addition. It'll lead to growth versus just incremental. And that's exactly the kind of things we're going to work through, is to make sure we don't make those mistakes for too long.
Can I back up on your statement that you said a minute ago that you really want us to get? So, and it's like I'm tracking with you because I've been hearing that statement a lot. And I'm there with it to some degree, but as I hear you say it, I just want to make sure that we clarify. So when you say, if you're not making disciple makers, then you're not actually making disciples. And where I guess that shakes me just a little bit is to say, looking back at the disciples that have been made that aren't necessarily making other disciples, do you just, I mean, you can't really just kick them out of the category of disciple because they are actually disciples. I look at it more as it's just disobedience, which is why we talk about obedience in
Yeah.
this. It's this pure obedience to Christ and
Yeah.
making disciple makers.
Yeah.
I don't feel like that I, went all this time and didn't actually make disciples.
Yeah.
I feel like I did that, but I really didn't make disciple makers. So I guess
Correct.
I hear it and I go, well, if you're not making disciple makers, then you're not making disciple makers. I guess it's kind of the way I'm
That's
thinking.
correct.
I don't want to argue about it.
No,
Just-
no, no.
I'm
But, no,
just
it's a
thinking
great.
in the context of I can't discount, because think how many we would actually discount and not call disciples if we said, well, if you're not making disciples, then you're not actually a disciple. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I'm just not sure I can jump to that as much as I could say, you can be a disciple, but be disobedient to Christ by not being a disciple maker.
That's correct.
I guess is where I'm.
So no, listen, we're not disagreeing. I'm just being bold
Yeah,
from a thought
yeah.
to push us thought wise.
Yeah.
It could also be this, it doesn't mean that they're not a believer.
Yeah, you can make Christians
You can-
without
yeah,
making
But
disciples.
I would say there were a lot of people that were followers of Jesus, wanted to hear him preach, hear him teach, hear him do miracles, but they weren't his disciples yet. Not just even the 12, but the 70 or the 120, whichever way you want to look at it. But again, in my perspective, I think there's a difference between a believer and a disciple.
Okay, now see, that
Yeah.
would help.
But that's
clarify
just,
some
I'm not
things
saying
and
that
break
that's the way it should
down,
be, but in
I
my
don't know.
mind, there are people that are believers whose lives are transformed, but they've gotten back to that comfortable, I don't know if you want to call it this dramatic carnal Christian life where they just live for the good and the comfort, and they love Jesus, but they're not necessarily a disciple pursuing hearing his voice, being obedient to him, going out and being what a disciple is. So in my mind, that's how I look at it. It's like, hey, there are a lot of lives that I help to change and transform with the help of God, and I discipled them, and they're believers with a transformed life, but they're not disciples pursuing and chasing after Jesus and being a disciple maker. So that's in my own mind as I've processed it.
But then what about the master of the house? He wasn't too happy with the ones that didn't reproduce fruit, and he threw them in the fire.
Yeah.
So did he make Christians or not?
Get to be another prophet here, okay? So I mean, that's I didn't. So here's a couple things that are important. By the way, it's just from a dialogue perspective. I actually agree. I actually think we should walk through what's the difference between a believer, a follower, a disciple, a discipler, a disciple maker. Like, I think all of those have some nuances, right? Here's why I would say, using the reverse from a definition perspective, again, to drive the conversation, not to be legalistic about the definition, to drive the conversation. I think the key, I would say, is I hear what you're saying that, hey, I didn't help them make disciple makers. And we could classify what they are, but here's the truth. The reason they're not disciple makers is more because no one ever told them that was the expectation.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
So they're as far as I've helped take them or that they've understood from Scripture
Right.
on their own.
Exactly.
So then the question is, how do I go, hey, I did this well, but let me add a piece on I've missed, right? Like, so that's where we stand up and go, hey, and you need to know something I'm going to say to you now. You really shouldn't give a crap about what I say. You should care what the Scripture says.
Mm-hmm.
And the hope is that what I'm saying is scriptural. So even in that definition, the question is what do you think Jesus is saying to us in Matthew 28?
Right. Make disciple makers.
Right. So so now the implication of that is, what does that mean for us? So that's why I like the negative statement, not from a legalistic judgmental, but from a, if I'm missing this piece, what do I need to adjust in my system to be successful or more successful? That's why we want to do that. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Which I think we're on agreement with. We're just making sure we're all on the same page, right?
Yeah.
Because I just think that's where I've grown in it. Like, I'm going, okay, if this is really what Jesus is saying, that is not what I've done well. I haven't done the second level well.
Yeah.
And so I can adjust on that, right? I'm trying
and I
to.
have purposefully tried to adjust my language as
Yeah.
I speak about. I mean, seriously, like
I know, I
over the
agree.
past months,
Yes.
just being purposeful about adjusting that, because it's so easy just to say disciple when that's not really what he's saying. When you read the full Great Commission,
Yeah.
if you don't add, you mentioned it that I said makers because
That's
I find
intentional.
myself using that language all the time now. I've used it with these guys, because you really do see that that is the thrust of what it is that he's
Yeah.
telling us.
Yeah.
Not really even just, I mean, he's commanding us.
Okay, he said it, not me, by the way. Yeah, it wasn't an ask.
No.
Seldom is.
No.
It wasn't a great ask.
Not a
right.
suggestion.
Right. It
No, that's what
wasn't.
I'm saying. That's
Yeah.
why it becomes disobedience
Mm.
to not actually do
Mhm.
that. And so we question why the church is as weak and things are as dark as they are in our nation, and we've lost our effectiveness and influence, or maybe we never really had it.
Mm.
I mean, we're tapped into the greatest power in the universe as believers, right? We're the greatest power in the entire universe living inside of us, yet we have the weakest presence in humanity, influence in humanity. And I think we have to ask why that is, and I really think this has something to do with it. I mean, that's really part of the reason why I'm here, is because I think this is the obedience, disobedience thing is what we really have to tap into.
When you first hear this plan, when I first heard this plan, probably for you guys too, it clicked in my head. It was like,
Yeah.
this is what we've been
This is
supposed
what's
to be
missing,
doing.
yeah.
This is what, and then I wondered, like, where did it get lost? I mean,
Yeah.
I was in the '80s. You know, I was out with the Let's Go Soul Winning crowd, knocking on
Yeah.
doors and trying to lead people to Christ. But we didn't go to this. We didn't know this, and yet this was right there in the book the whole time.
Yeah.
This is what we were supposed to
Right,
be doing.
exactly.
But we stopped at the getting them saved at the door
Yeah.
and walked away.
So
And I don't know why.
I spoke at a church a few weeks ago, the church that I helped plant a while back, and I really wondered, because I'm preaching this now. I mean, I'm just
Yeah.
laying it, because really I want to mobilize the body of Christ. We talked about it being the big fast, but it's like, man, I just have this burning desire to mobilize the entire body, right? So whenever you get a platform and opportunity, preach it. So I preach it, but I just didn't really feel like most people really got it. I mean, to be honest with you, but you never know, you know. But I stepped down, and this one guy said to me, he said, Scott, he said, I am with you. He said, I always have thought, and this guy's been a believer for a long time, Brent Honeycutt Grady. And he said, Scott, he said, I'm with you, man. He said, I always knew there had to be more. And when he said that, I mean, it just made it worth it all to me for him to say that, you know, because that's the way I'm feeling. And I feel like there's so many that are sitting in our gatherings, and they just, man, there has to be more than this. There's got to be more than knowledge, right? And I think making disciple makers is what has the ability to tap into fulfilling that and satisfying that. And I think it's a God-given, like, void in us. Like
I agree.
it's purposed by God. Like, you're not going to be satisfied in this until you're doing what I've told you to do. I only told you to do one thing.
I think there's 3 responses you get when you preach this. Over the years, just watching any level of obligation to reproduce being preached, you got a crowd that's going to go for it. They're going to be motivated. You got a crowd that's going to get mad at you, that get off their backs. You got another crowd that's going to go, that wasn't for me. I'm not a preacher. He's talking to preachers. He's talking, and they don't think it's for them. They duck it. They don't. So it's a matter of trying to draw all of them together and get everybody to understand this is for you, and it's not a bad thing. It's
But
not a
that's what a
scary
lot of
thing.
people hear is, oh, we've done this all wrong. But that's not what you're saying.
That's not at all.
But you're
what
never
we're
saying that.
No.
No.
In fact,
Just a little bit.
Well, no.
Well, we just haven't done it all right.
Hey, turn to page 8 in the blue book real quick. Page 8.
I'm saying it.
Let's keep one thing,
Devil's advocate.
just words. By the way, they're real simple. We have this longer written, but we're going to talk about this constantly together. This is part of the shifts and the understanding and the statements of it. Somebody, you see where it says belief, skills, and values under there? Somebody just read that first paragraph underneath belief, skills, and values. Just so y'all know, I'm going to do this all day long, every day, every time we're together, so let's not waste time. Somebody read that first paragraph, and we'll just...
As a disciple,
there we go, yeah.
As a disciple and disciple maker, there are essential beliefs, skills, and values we should understand and develop to help us grow and live as mature followers of Jesus. We can define this simply.
Somebody read beliefs.
The biblical principles and understandings that develop a firm foundation leading to a spirit-filled, faith-filled, and loving lifestyle.
Somebody read skills.
the habits, patterns, and lifestyle behaviors we develop that help us grow and live as mature disciples and disciple makers.
And values, or we're going to talk about the word habits or practices. We're kind of using better language now, more language to help people understand. Somebody read that.
The heartbeat and desires that reflect a lifestyle of obedience as mature disciples and disciple makers.
So let me explain these 3 words real quick with the context we're talking about. Let's just say evangelism. So if I go to the average church, I go to your church. Scott, I'm going to come to your church Sunday.
Come on.
And if I stood up in your pulpit to your people, right, and you're standing next to me, and we just said, hey, Scott, how many people in your church believe you need a personal faith relationship with Jesus Christ to go to heaven? How many people in your church are going to probably agree with that statement? Okay, so the vast majority, right? How many people? Most of you all, vast majority. But then let's ask question number 2. Hey, how many people in your church right now could walk across the street to the gas station attendant and present the gospel to them by sharing their story and God's story? How many people? Okay, wait, wrong. So let's say out of the average 100 people in your church, how many people do you think could do it? 5. So, okay, step 1. Y'all with me now? So we have a group of people with incredible belief, but they don't have the most basic skill to carry out that belief. Okay? So what we do, we look at, hey, you know what I'll do? Hey, this afternoon, why don't we train anybody who wants, come out, we'll train you how to share your story and God's story. And out of that 185 say, yeah, I'm going to come. So they come out, and we teach them how to share God's story and share their story, right? And then we come back, I show back up a month later. And I come up and go, hey man, after we did that training, how many people shared their story and God's story over the last month? What do you think the answer might be?
How many
Oh, well, we did the
gospel conversation?
gospel.
Yeah.
We
There's
had
14 in the class. How many went?
Like
They're getting a
8,
real
maybe.
number. This is good. I like this.
Maybe 8 from the
7.
14, 7 or 8.
7 or 8.
So half of them actually went and did it.
Yeah.
Well,
Is that with you guys?
they went as groups and walked around like the mall.
So
and
14 or so were trained. Half of them then went out and shared. And then let's ask the question, how many have come back with you with the story sent saying they've shared?
oh, since.
Since.
The wah, wah.
Okay. Y'all see? Okay. Did everyone just hear what they said?
Yeah.
There, 14 people came to a training, but 7 or 8 of them had the guts. I'm going to go out with you and do it as a group. They did it. And since that training and going out as a group, how many of them have picked it up and done it since? The answer was 0.
None that we know of.
So let me make sure you hear these 3 words. The belief that people need Jesus, it's a belief, a knowledge. It's over here. Then our people need to be trained in this skill of how to present their story and God's story to be able to present the gospel to somebody. But until it becomes a value and habit in their life, an actual practice, nothing changes. They just gave real numbers from their church. Y'all catching this? Mm-hmm. So if I want to think, my church has a heart for the lost. Oh, but no one knows how to share the story. And for those who did know how to share their story, they don't actually share it. So, here's the goal. Belief, skills, by the way, use the word practice instead of values, Mark. By the way, our end result is their values changed, but what I found is this. Until their practice changed, their value doesn't become different. So, I can value exercise deep down in my soul, but I haven't done a crunch in a while, okay? I'm just telling you, like, I haven't exercised too hard, right? So, when you know it's a true value, my sons, by the way, value exercise. My sons each work out 2 hours every day. They always have. I'll show you pictures later if you want. They look like they do. My son, I got like a 2-liter. He doesn't have a 6-pack. He's got the 22-pack. Like, he's got one of those that goes all the way down here. It's ridiculous. And so, but that's not just that's not a belief. He's got the skill to do it, and he practices it every day, which proves what he values. Does that make sense?
Repeat that one more time. You said until your practice changes.
So here's what. Let me give it the opposite. Let me spin it around. By the way, I'm rewriting this part right here, just so you know. The end result, what you really want from a follower of Jesus, is to have new values and new habits. That's what you want out of them, right? You want them to have a new lifestyle following Jesus. Values and habits become based on beliefs, skills, and practices. I believe certain things, I learn how to do it, and I actually put it into practice, and that will reveal what my new lifestyle looks like, my new values and habits. So if I want to change the values, habits of a person, I can't just do it by knowledge. I've got to give them skills, and then I actually have to do it. By the way, here's the one thing I would come back and encourage you to do. With the 7 that went out and do it, if you pulled the 7 back and say, hey guys, let me ask you this question. How many of you shared recently? Hey, who's 3 people that you could actually, that you know need Jesus? Have them write them down. How could you pray for those 3 people? And then, by the way, hey, would you go share your story with one of them this week? And my guess is, if you specifically asked that, then the 7 could probably come up with the 20 names. They could actually pray for the 20 people. And imagine if all 7 of them went out and shared their story with one person that week. Then the next week you got them share it with the second person. The next week you got them share it with the third person. All of a sudden you've created a completely different pattern and habit by you changing your system. Do y'all get that? I gave them a belief. I trained them in a skill. You were good. You went and modeled it with them. You had them go do it. Now all you have to do is bring it back up and go, now how do we get this to a daily practice? You just need to add that 4th component.
Part of the training was writing down names, but I saw it. You saw it come over their faces. I know what's coming next. I know what he's getting ready to do to me. This is a trap.
Right.
I write these 3 names down. He's going to make me do something with these 3 names.
Yeah.
That's why only 7 went out.
Right. But here's the thing. Until you get them to come back and keep working on that.
Yeah.
And by the way, if they're not going to do that, by the way, they shouldn't be part of this training. Y'all, which we're going to talk about later. That's who you're looking for. The person over there who, when they walk through it, they'll go, okay, I'm going to try it.
Yep.
And they're okay with you coming back later going, so tell me how it went this past week. What can I do? Hey, do you need me to go with you?
I think that's the key.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, agreed.
Because most are going to be too scared to do it, and then when they come back and they didn't do it, then they'll feel like more of a failure and they won't come back. But if you go, hey, what's one person on the list that you can go to coffee with this week? I'll come with you.
Yeah.
And I'll make it easy for you. I tell my people it's super simple. I'm just going to say, hey, like a guy, Justice. It's like, Justice, what's one person that you want to share it with? All right, you set up the time, you set up the date. I'll make sure I make myself available. And I said I'm going to make it really simple. We'll hang out. We'll talk about whatever they want to talk about for a little bit. And then I'll just say, hey, Junior, have you ever heard Justice's story? No?
Yeah,
No.
good.
Dude, you ought to hear it. Is that cool? And then he already knows, because we've worked on it, how to share it in 2 or 3 minutes in a way that creates a thirst.
Yeah.
And then I say, hey, do you have a story like that? I mean, what's your journey been like? And then he shares it. And then I say, and I let them know exactly how it's going to go. And I'll say, then I'm going to ask them, hey, would it be all right if I shared with you what changed Justice's
in the conversation.
life? So I'll share the gospel for you this time, Justice, so that you see it. And then it's super easy. And then at the end, they're like, that was pretty cool. Hey, we want to come to Justice's house. He's going to do a Discovery Bible study. So I try to help set that stage. And what you'll find is the more time you invest in going with your Timothys, the more fruit you'll see.
Absolutely. But you're going to need blanks. It's almost like you need a blank slate. When I got saved, I knew nothing. And the pastor, I said, what do I do now? And the pastor said, come on visitation with me on Thursday nights. And it was my hometown. I grew up there. I was petrified at every door we knocked on it. I was going to know the person that came to the door, and I was going to be embarrassed. But after a couple of weeks of that, and after a couple of them came to the door, it's all right, whatever. And I got used to it. But I had to start out with a willing blank slate. And if if I'd have gotten into some bad habits a few years later, couldn't have dragged me out of the house to knock on the doors and embarrass myself. You get that. So anyway, that's my opinion.
So belief, skills, practices. It's that simple. That's what we need to do. So we need a foundation. The foundation for the Leaning Tower of Pisa, right? It's not just built based on beliefs. It's a skill and a practice. So here's what we want to do. I'm going to quickly give you some definitions that we're just going to use because it's going to become common language. We're going to take a short break. Then I'm going to teach you what a group looks like, how we look back, look up, and look forward. I'm going to teach you that in about 10 minutes. And then we're actually going to start, Matt's going to train the session on how to share your story. So we're actually going to go right to it, a group time. And it'll take about 45 minutes or an hour and walk through it, that you're learning a belief, then we're going to give you a skill, then we're going to have you actually practice it here so that you can then go do it there. And he'll explain it. He's going to lead it just like it's a group, okay? So he'll be modeling for you the example of what you could do. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So let's just do this. Turn over to page 5 real quick in your book. Let me just make sure you understand a couple definitions. We'll pick up more tomorrow because we're going to use this language constantly. So, and later we'll come back. So when you read your books later, like on page 4, you'll see purposes and expected outcomes. So this is part of what we're looking to have come out of them. So in chapter 1, we're hoping this is page 4, we're hoping that every disciple maker will experience a spirit-filled life. And it says untying and raising their sails daily. So that's a belief we're doing and a skill we're actually going to get you to do. And when we talk about how we do groups, the goal of the groups is to help you put it into practice. I'll explain that as soon as we come back from break. Now go over to page 8. I'm sorry, page 5. I apologize. Page 5. Basic terminology. I just need you to know 4 quick things before we go for a break. Number 1, a training center. So in this room, you will be Paul's leading a training center. A training center is just this. It's a location wherever you train, learn, and planning takes place. Wherever you bring your Timothys together, you're going to be a Paul, you're going to have Timothys. I'll give you the definition. A training center is just, that's when you gather your people together and train them. Number 2, you're a Paul. The Paul is the primary trainer and mentor. The Pauls model all of the skills while working with their Timothys. Pauls intentionally help the Timothys make disciples and hold them accountable to follow through in the next generation. Does that make sense? Right there, 5. That's what we're doing. That's what you're doing with your Timothys. A Timothy is this. It's a disciple maker and a trainer. So you identify people in your church who are willing to be Timothys. They're disciple makers and trainers. The Timothys are accountable to their Paul, and they are trained to bring new believers to Christ, disciple them, and lead them to do the same. Timothys intentionally help these new believers, so they lead someone to Christ. We call them Tituses. Make disciples and hold them accountable to follow through to multiple generations. So I'm a Paul. I'm growing my Timothy to reach lost people who will one day be their Tituses. So I'm developing them. They're going to lead a bunch of people to Christ, but they're going to intentionally grab some and develop them to do the exact same thing. So we're just using Paul, Timothy, and Titus. It's not a perfect biblical model of an illustration going down, but conceptually y'all get me, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, just making sure conceptually we're all good. And then that Titus is just a new believer who's specifically identified by Timothy to be trained to be a disciple maker. And Tituses are accountable to Timothys and trained by them to bring new believers to Christ, disciple them, lead them to do the same. So if I've led this whole side to Christ, but I look at a Junior, and Junior, I'm like, man, Junior, he shows up early, he's reaching more people, he's doing this stuff. I could pour into all of them, but I'm going to spend a little extra time with Junior. So he's just become my Titus. So out of a group, we tend to identify Tituses. And by the way, we'll talk about this tomorrow before we leave. One of the goals a year from now is Junior as my Titus will become a Timothy. And then the one who helped me, Tim as my Timothy, who helped me mentor my Titus, he's now going to move up and potentially become a Paul. And later we're going to say the best Pauls will begin to influence others and move up and become more like a master trainer. So they just become a Paul over Pauls, but a master trainer is helping people. And then if you're one that you've started Timothys, who reached Tituses, who reached the next generation, who reached the next generation, you actually are what we refer to as a movement leader. Someone when you start seeing 4 generations deep and 100 wide. Which sounds like a lot.
How many movements we got in the U.S. right now?
0. We would have people en route to a movement in multiple places. For those who listen to Exponential would identify one movement in the entire United States that has actually gone multiple generations deep and wide.
Based upon this.
That's what they would. Yeah, this would be based upon an international definition on what they would refer to movements around the world. If you hear missionaries talk about movements, they'll talk about 4 generations deep, 100 wide would be the beginning of the movement.
100 wide churches, not
100 wide churches. Yeah.
But that would consider like the
You're
micro church.
considering a
Is
church.
That would be correct. That would be
Right.
like, yeah.
Not just a group, but a fully functioning micro church.
And we would and we'll talk. See, I don't want to get you overwhelmed.
Right.
Like we can get into lots of weeds right now. We won't do that. Well, we can. I mean, as much as you need to ask any question anytime. I just don't want to confuse you in any way. So, like, if for example, let's act like I'm the Paul and you're my Timothys. So I've got me 10 Timothys right now, and all 10 of you by the end of this year, you've each led 10 people to Christ, and you've identified 2 key people that you're developing, and those 2 key people go out and start churches a year from now. That means now we've got 10 people who started 20 churches, and you've identified 2 people who can now go start 20 more churches. So, I mean, that could be 40 churches a year from now, you know what I mean? A year later, developing them. So, it's 4 deep, 100 wide. And we'll talk more about this. I don't want to overwhelm you. It's actually, sounds crazy. It's actually easier than you think. Who was the one? We'll show you some of the stories, because
Yep.
you weren't at last year's GPW, though. You were at the GPW.
Not last year, but
Okay,
the year before.
year before.
Yeah.
So last year they had one person over in, man, was it Myanmar? I think it was
Yeah.
Myanmar. That's the 13 deep.
Yep.
And that was a year, wasn't it? 1 year
It might
or
be
18
long-
months? It might be 18 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they brought all the people, 13 people, where the first person led the second led the third led 13 people deep in 18 months.
Wow.
So that would be a 13th generation. So this last person doesn't even know who the first person is. You know, they came to Christ through this person, who came to Christ through this person, and they're all starting micro churches and stuff off of it. Now that's an extreme example. I'm just telling you it's the reality. Of new people.
But that's where your three shifts in the U.S. to make a movement is we hear something like that and I go, oh my goodness, and immediately it goes, God, what has to happen for that to happen? And that's what you're saying. Those 3 things that start. I mean, that right there.
Yeah.
I don't know where I've never been to Myanmar. I don't know anything
Yeah.
about Myanmar. I bet they have a lot less distractions in Myanmar.
Well-
I bet they don't have cable TV or.
Lot more persecution. though.
Yeah,
Of
like,
course, yeah.
Two things. Persecution's up. Hey, I got to be honest. The more I go along, the number one problem with wealth is it's a distraction.
Yes, we're
It's where
distracted.
Jesus says the wealth of this, the deceitfulness of wealth. And here's the thing: all you have to do is just go spend a week in the woods without any electronics, and your whole world will change.
Get out your air
But
conditioner from
right. If you're here, every bit of this world is distracting you, and when you're out there, all you do is go, "Holy crap, God is big."
Yeah.
And nature's scary, even though it's beautiful. It's scary, and there's got to be something more.
Yeah.
If I've got 24 hours of entertainment today in the background, I don't even hear the rest
In
of
an
it.
air conditioned house, no reason to leave.
Yeah, the distraction that Satan uses typically globally is persecution. Here in the States, it's prosperity.
Yeah,
what
that's
I think.
exactly.
Yeah.
Until now, this is the first time we're about to see the big wave.
But, yeah, the
Yeah.
persecution. Yeah.
Persecution,
that's
persecution, coming.
Persecution.
That's right.
It's coming.
So, training center is what you get to gather your leaders together. You're the Paul training Timothys that when they lead people to Jesus, begin to disciple them, will become their Tituses, who will later begin to lead people to Jesus and bring them to Christ also and grow up. And then the pipeline, which we'll show tomorrow, is just after you've developed and done it for a period of time, you shift up to the next role. So you all could be doing exactly what I'm doing a year or 2 from now. Scott, I think this might be part of your whisper. What's God asking you to do? But what I appreciate about him is by the way, he could teach us better than I can teach it. From a knowledge perspective, at least, right? He's a gifted communicator. But he wants to go put it into practice. Put it into practice, and then he can speak out of, hey, this is what I've been trying to do. So good and bad. Okay, let's do this. Let's take a 10-minute break. Try not to make it 23 minutes like last time. I want you to have more than 10. Then we're going to come back. We're going to tell you what the format is and then actually move into the session. And then we'll take a break after that and get a snack around 5:30. Let's go.